On this weekend's Afterwards, James Rosen of Fox News examines the political career of Dick Cheney. He's interviewed by former Bush administration press secretary Dana Perino.
All right, James, I've been waiting for this moment where I could interrogate you. It's a pleasure. I've known you for a long time. When I was at the White House and then being at Fox, and we're colleagues, and we're also readers and authors. So this is a real joy for me because I've loved your writing.
Thank you.
And what you put together in Cheney One-on-One. I spent an entire weekend thinking that I knew everything I needed to know about Dick Cheney because I worked under him for 8 years. But what you help provide is just peeling back the curtain of what you call America's most controversial statesman. And I wanted to start there. Do you think that Dick Cheney, as his role as vice president, and then even after the administration, do you think he's the most controversial statesman?
First of all, it's great to be with you, Dana, and thank you for doing this. Well, I think that certainly a fair case could be made for that. As I write in the book, no one on the right has attracted more vitriol from the left, more intense vitriol from the left than Dick Cheney, with the possible exceptions of the man he served in the White House, George W. Bush, or Richard Nixon. And I think there's very logical reasons for that, in a sense, which is that here's a man who stood at or near the pinnacle of power in this country for really 4 decades, rather uniquely, from the Watergate era right up through 9/11 and Iraq and beyond. And you don't stick around at those levels unless you're really good and really effective. And I think that's why the left has had such an obsession with Dick Cheney. And you see this even in Barack Obama's comments today. He called Dick Cheney, in response to this interview and reporting of it that was widespread, the worst president of his lifetime. Now, there's a joke there, obviously, but it speaks to, A, Dick Cheney's extraordinary influence on our times, and B, the central role that he occupies in the intellectual universe of Barack Obama.
Right. He's in it. Dick Cheney is in the left's head.
And under their skin, for sure.
That's true. So tell me about getting the interview, because having been the press secretary in the Bush administration, at the end there, Dick Cheney was a reluctant interviewer. Okay, so how did this come about that you had got actually a chance to spend several hours with him, longer than even he had agreed to, and he opens up about everything?
Well, there's a backstory here, as you know, from our dealings way back when. I covered the Bush-Cheney White House for Fox News in real time. I traveled the world with Dick Cheney on the Air Force One blue and white fleet of airplanes. We went to Europe together. We went to the Middle East. These are situations where you're hitting 10 countries in 8 days, that sort of thing. And we also went to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. On the last of those trips I did with him in 2005, the end of 2005 in Pakistan, as is the custom, Fox News, meaning me, was supposed to get an interview with the principal, the vice president, on the ground somewhere on that trip. Dana Bash of CNN got her interview. It took place on the side of a snowy mountain in Pakistan. She was very upset at the end because she felt that the setting wasn't right. And then Steve Schmidt, who was running press for Vice President Cheney at that time, later of Game Change fame, announced that they were cutting the trip short because it was believed that the vice president, in his role as president of the Senate, needed to cast a tie-breaking vote in what was then a 50-50 Senate. And Schmidt and the others assured me, Rosen, when we get back to Washington, we promise you, you're going to get this interview with the vice president. We won't forget. We won't let anyone Bigfoot you. You're going to do this. And of course, as soon as the wheels of Air Force Two touched down at Joint Base Andrews, just outside of Washington, everybody not named James Rosen promptly forgot about James Rosen's scheduled interview with Dick Cheney. The next time,
I wouldn't have forgotten.
No, this did not involve you, regrettably. And the next time the vice president sat down with Fox News was in February of '06 for a very dramatic sit-down with our chief anchor at the time, Britt Hume, for the purpose of explaining how and why the vice president had come to shoot his friend in the face on a hunting trip in Texas. And as I sat in my office and watched that interview, I thought to myself, it's going to be a long time, old boy, before you get to sit down with this man, if ever. Fast forward 9 years, and I ran into the Cheneys at a party in Washington. And after enduring some good-natured ribbing from the vice president about my recent notoriety as the subject of an FBI investigation, I said, I've got a bone to pick with you, sir. He said, what's that? I said, the Pakistan interview from 2005. I'm still waiting. He remembered. I said, sir, if we were to amortize the 7.5 minutes I would have received with you in 2005, I think today we'd be up to something like 28 hours of Nixon-Frost-style interviews. He said, well, talk to Liz. Let's do something. That turned out to be lunch, just the two of us, for 2 hours, where we sort of sketched out what an extended oral history for Dick Cheney might look and sound like. In the end, we agreed to do 6 hours, 2 hours a day for 3 straight days. No subject was off limits. He sought no control over the editorial, nor any reward from the enterprise. And in the end, instead of 6 hours, we went close to 10 hours.
So let's go back to the beginning. One of the things I've always admired about Dick Cheney, and a lot of people think that because I was born in Wyoming that I knew the Cheneys growing up, but I didn't. I didn't have a chance to meet him until I came to work at the White House. But I've always appreciated what I consider his Western sensibilities. Okay, so he talks about growing up out West, and I wonder if you could talk about, of all the people you've interviewed, and there have been many, do you see a difference in somebody that grew up in sort of the setting that he did compared to others who may have grown up with on the coast?
This is a really important point, I think, that you've brought up, which is that to the extent that Dick Cheney has been depicted as withholding, elusive, enigmatic, maybe even menacing, I think a lot of that has to do with who does, by and large, who does the writing about Dick Cheney, which tend to be Easterners. And to the Eastern ear, the way that Westerners like Dick Cheney talk can come off somehow alien or come up short somehow, as if they're being withholding or enigmatic. In fact, what has been my experience is that Dick Cheney tells you exactly what he thinks, but he does it with the Westerner's classic economy of words. And so he hides in plain sight, in a sense. But as a congressman, he amassed one of the most conservative voting records in the House, and he proudly notes that today in the book, and says that even today it would be thusly regarded. But he had a low-key style. He was not a bomb thrower. This enabled Dick Cheney to be able to talk not only to the opposite side of the aisle, the Democrats, but also to various factions within his own party. And part of that has to do with that Western style of his, which is low-key, not attention-seeking, not bomb-throwing, but direct and clear.
One of my favorite things about being in meetings with the vice president was how he'd be very quiet. And, you know, that can be a little intimidating. When somebody is quiet, you think, well, you don't know what he's thinking or doing. And I saw an interview with him where he said that he learned when he worked for Ford. He learned that it's better for the principals not to weigh in the middle of a discussion when you have a policy time meeting where lots of different staffers are offering their opinion, because as soon as the principal says something, then that will shut down conversation and people won't offer their opinions. And that gave me a different viewpoint about why he kept silent. It wasn't that he was being secretive. I think that he was listening.
He's a good listener, but he also understands that the action sometimes doesn't take place in the big interagency debate session, but rather in the Oval Office afterwards. And he's also, as we have noted, an avid hunter, and I think Dick Cheney knows when to save his gunpowder.
The other day I was talking to somebody in preparation for this interview and saying how much I enjoyed the book because I think it is very good. And he was saying that back in the day on Capitol Hill, when the Wyoming delegation of Cheney, Wallop, and Simpson was there, that they were the most powerful delegation in the Congress at the time. And I don't think that a small state like Wyoming has had something like that ever since.
Well, and they were probably pretty well knitted up, better than most delegations. But yes, for 10 years, Dick Cheney was the sole congressman, member of Congress from Wyoming.
Could you talk to me, too, about his career is remarkable before the age of 40, when in his late 30s he has his first heart attack. From the age of 19, where he was kind of a screw-up, admitted screw-up, right? He's not really knuckled down like his wife Lynn Cheney was, where she was advancing. And so tell me about how does he get from the age of 19 to 34? That trajectory is quite amazing.
There's very few American stories like it, frankly. But your reference to Lynn Cheney and her studiousness brings up a fun thing, which is that I interviewed her in the year 2000 for an oral history project I did for the late great Talk magazine, then edited by Tina Brown, where they asked me on a crash basis to prepare an oral history of Dick Cheney's life, culminating with his assumption of the vice presidency, which was just about to happen. And that was a fascinating project. Interviewed Lynn Cheney, Gerald Ford. I think it's the only interview Gerald Ford ever did, exclusively devoted to Dick Cheney. But, and I asked Mrs. Cheney, and I said, it's been suggested, ma'am, that of the two of you, you're the brains of the operation. Is that true? And she said, well, I am the more assiduous academic, which was a sort of a winking reference to the vice president's undistinguished beginnings in terms of his schooling. He actually secured a full scholarship to Yale University. So
remarkable.
He goes, okay, for a kid from Wyoming, right?
Well, Nebraska originally, right?
Originally born in Nebraska, raised in Wyoming, that's right. And he had never been farther east than Chicago. All right, he had a brief sort of stay at Northwestern in high school. And one of the things that disappointed him about Yale was that there was no big sky over his head anymore. He just felt ill at ease with the actual physical surroundings and the people to some extent. And he fell in with a high-spirited group of people, as the dean later came to say. He tells me in Cheney one-on-one about how he and his college roommates had an apartment situation where all of 4 of the bedroom doors opened up onto a common area, but they decided to use one of the bedrooms as a bar. And he drank too much beer. And his studies collapsed. And he racked up 2 DUIs by the time he was 19 years old, the second of which found the future vice president of the United States waking up in jail in Wyoming. And he tells me in the book, this was the wake-up call. He didn't have to completely give up drinking, but he knew he had to set his path right. He flunked out of Yale, goes back to Wyoming, builds power line as a lineman for the county, okay, and is paying his own way now through the University of Wyoming.
My dad's alma mater.
Is that right? $96 a semester at the time, and finds, guess what? When I'm paying my own way and I'm invested in it, in every sense of the word, I'm a good student, and he got straight A's. And through a succession of internships and other visits to the Capitol, he eventually found himself working for a congressman who later went to work in the Nixon administration named Don Rumsfeld. Yep. And that's really the beginning of his path to power. But by the time he's 34, as you mentioned, this guy who had at 19 been waking up in a jail in Wyoming was the chief of staff to the President of the United States. It really is a remarkable story.
Did he form his political ideology before Yale or after, when he comes back?
I think that as of his time at Yale, he hadn't really devoted too much thought to politics at all. I think that he probably shared some of the ingrained conservatism of Westerners. His father, as a matter of fact, worked for the Soil Conservation Service, which is a federal agency. So he didn't start out with some hostility to the state or to the government.
And his sister spent a career working for the federal government.
That's right. But I think his interest in politics started to accelerate once he met Lynn Cheney in high school and was dating her throughout college, and then after college he majored in political science. And as a matter of fact, the only even quasi-regret that I heard Dick Cheney utter in 10 hours across 3 days of interviewing with him had nothing to do with 9/11 or Iraq or Afghanistan or interrogation or detention or campaigns and elections or any of those things. He said that he wished, instead of political science when he was in college, that he had studied history, because he is a deep lover of history, and to spend time in his studies to observe his great communion with the discipline of history. All those books he's read, a biography, military history, diplomatic history.
Is he trying to catch up to Lynn?
Right. Yes, he will not, assuredly. But and he said that he wished he had studied history because, in his experience, and this is someone, again, who has been at or near the center of power for 40 years, he said, government really is, it's not a science, it's art, and it is the application of lessons from history, from past case studies to contemporary problems. That's what it is. And so the only real regret I heard him really express was that he hadn't been a history major.
That part of the book struck me, too, because I worked with Charles Krauthammer when he did his collection, Things That Matter. And when he was asked by students, you know, if I want to become a political pundit or a columnist one day, what should I study in journalism school? And he said, don't go to journalism school. You should study history. And in the book, the vice president, even to this day, it sounds like, is reading history books and seeing the parallels. He talks a lot about Marshall, actually.
Yeah, George C. Marshall. The interesting thing about that is that I sensed a touch of despair in Dick Cheney by virtue of the fact that it's getting a bit harder, given the peculiar circumstances of the 21st century, to find useful lessons from the past to be applied today because of the unique constellation of problems we face, not only the nuclear age, but unique 21st century features such as stateless actors, asymmetric warfare, and so on.
Well, that caught me because we are talking a lot about how to deal with lone wolf terrorists who might be radicalized by the internet and using encryption devices in order to communicate. And so that if you're looking to history to try to guide you, there's very little, except for being sure to act and being stalwart and
good intelligence in
all
advance.
Of those things.
Right.
But that I thought was very astute thinking.
And you know, the fact is that even when we set aside domestic attacks like we saw in San Bernardino, when we become embroiled in overseas conflicts, like for example the Iraq War, again we're having asymmetric warfare practiced against our forces. And I think, and I bet the Vice President would agree, although I shouldn't speak for him, that the United States has yet to demonstrate that we can decisively win an asymmetric war. Perhaps it's a feature of asymmetric warfare that they can't be decisively won. I don't know.
So one of the reasons that he is controversial is because after 9/11, the country asked our intelligence community to do some very difficult things in order to help protect us. I know that he doesn't have regrets. Does he know how controversial he is? And does
Yes.
it bother him?
Yes and no.
Okay.
He knows. And the very last question I asked him at the end of the 10 hours, we had spent 3 days together in his study, I finally allowed the words Darth Vader to escape my lips. Mm-hmm. And I asked him if he believes that that caricature of him is going to prevail in historical memory of him, such that he is popularly or widely misunderstood. And he said, in essence, that he feels very grateful and privileged to have taken part in so many historic events, and that he doesn't feel sorry for himself about the way people view him, but that in general he doesn't spend a lot of time dwelling on how people view him. That's right. There
was a part in the book where he talks about, it was on page 9, it's in your introduction, and the question you ask is it fair to say that your influence on Bush's decision-making waned in the second term? And I really appreciated his answer because I thought it showed just such humility that by the time that there's a second term, a president is more sure-footed.
Yes.
And that his experience that he brought to the table was maybe even more necessary in the first term than the second term. Right. Is that how you took that?
Yes, but it raises a subsequent question which I posed to him, which was, well, here now then, if we accept your version of things, we have a president who in his second term has greater confidence in foreign policy and national security decision-making. Why should that greater confidence on the part of the president have led him to reject your counsel more frequently, rather than accept it even more frequently? And he said, in essence, listen, nobody ever gave me any guarantees he would always do what I wanted him to do. Mm-hmm. But the strain between them can be overstated. That is most distinctly evidenced in their dispute over Scooter Libby. Mm-hmm. But, for example, as the Vice President points out in Cheney one-on-one, he and the President were on the same page where the surge in Iraq was concerned, even though, quite strikingly, Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and the Joint Chiefs of Staff were not on the same page about whether there should be a surge or not. And Cheney's advice, along with that of Jack Keane and many other people, prevailed with President Bush.
And the White House was a lonely place at the time. I mean, the President had to convince many people in his cabinet.
And the Congress. Yeah.
He's pretty open about his differences of opinion with Secretary Condoleezza Rice. Mm-hmm. But I don't see it as personal. And that's what I took away from one-on-one.
Yes. Look, in all administrations, as you know, there will be conflicts of personality, conflicts of ideology, interagency disputes, and it actually is a healthy part of the process. Mm-hmm. There's no question but that Dick Cheney clashed with Condoleezza Rice and also with Colin Powell. The difference, as he tells me in the book, is that with Condoleezza Rice, he never felt it became personal. Mm-hmm. And I think they still have a cordial relationship today. With Powell, it did become personal, and there is no relationship there today, and I think I sense some regret on Cheney's part that it turned out that way. The irony is that a decade earlier, when Cheney was Defense Secretary and Powell was the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the two had served quite well together and helping lead the country to victory in the Gulf War. Mm-hmm. A decade later, in the run-up to the Iraq War, that relationship didn't survive.
And does he express any regret about the first Gulf War and how that ended?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think he rightly regards it as as perhaps one of the last very clear-cut victories for the United States military, and it wasn't foreordained that it would be so. One of the things he talks about in the book is that there was a culture within the top echelons of the Pentagon in the early 1990s where so many of the officers had cut their teeth during Vietnam when the civilian leadership didn't quite back up the military the way it should have. And so there was great hesitation to act on the part of the military amongst the senior ranks of officers in the early 90s. And one of the things that Cheney and George H.W. Bush worked hard on doing was assuring the military officers that they would have, their men in the field would have the support they needed from the civilian leadership.
What about on the personal side of things with his family? Because some politicians go through their entire careers and they keep themselves, they keep their families a little bit at a distance. And I think that is true for somebody like a Speaker Paul Ryan. A lot of people don't know that his wife is Jana and then their kids. But Liz, well, Lynn, we've already talked about, and Liz and Mary were very active in not only the campaigns, but also Liz in the administration. I've always admired how close he is to his daughters, and does he talk about that in the book?
Someone, while I was writing this book, said to me, there's only 3 people that Dick Cheney is really tight with, and they're all named Cheney. But, and again, that may be a function of their Western roots in some sense. But Liz Cheney, as you know, served in the Bush-Cheney administration in the State Department in a very important role in the Near East Bureau, which handles the Middle East. And she has been a co-author on 2 of his books, his memoir and his most recent one, a foreign policy book. I think he derives comfort from having his family around him. I think it is a source of anguish for him, quite understandably, that occasionally differences of opinion about different things between his daughters has seeped out into public view. And you know, one of the most personal subjects that we touch on in Cheney One-on-One is his daughter Mary's decision to come out to him in an airport. And this really struck me as fascinating, Dana, because I knew it would be sensitive to ask him about it. He's been asked about it before. It had been quite improperly a campaign issue that the Kerry campaign used in 2004, quite improperly. But he is, in his own memoir, which he titles, the subtitle, it's In My Time, a personal and political memoir. So he's telling us he's writing a personal memoir, so I felt free to ask about personal things. I said there were only 2 sentences in that whole book about this moment when your daughter comes out to you. In essence, she tells you this, and you respond simply to the effect that you love her, and whatever makes her happy makes you happy, and that's fine. And I said, now, that seemed to me to be a place of great equanimity with this. I read between the lines that this wasn't exactly a surprise to you when Mary said this to you. And that somehow you had, in thinking about it before that moment, made your way to this place of equanimity where you could reply as you did. And a lot of parents out there confronted with such news might not be in that place. And what advice would you have for them to get to that place so they could respond as you did? And he first made it clear that he hadn't intended to write a book of advice for parents of gay children. But he did then tell me, actually, it was a surprise when she came out to him. It wasn't something that we all kind of knew about and didn't talk about. Now, I found that striking because even in the 80s, when discussion of gay and lesbian issues wasn't as prominent in everyday life as it is today, chances are, if your daughter is a lesbian, you would probably have some inkling of that. The fact that he really didn't strikes me that he was, at that time, someone who was deeply, deeply immersed in his career. And elsewhere in the book, apropos of something else, he does say something that I thought bears on this. He said, there was a time in my life where I thought that how well you did at something was a direct function of how many hours you put into it or how many cups of coffee you drank while you were doing it. So I have the feeling that he was putting a lot of hours into his work and drinking a lot of cups of coffee, such that he was surprised by this news.
Yeah, that he didn't know. And also, if we could just touch a little bit on his health, because this is a person who has an amazing career in politics, then another in the private sector, gets recruited back into politics, and he really, as far as I know, he never intended to be the vice president of the United States. So he tells jokes about the best way to be the vice president is to run the search committee.
Right. Well, and because Dick Cheney led the search committee for George W. Bush's vice presidential nominee in 2000 and wound up as the nominee, a lot of people have seen fit to ascribe some sort of Machiavellian purposefulness to Dick Cheney in that matter. And fact is, and George W. Bush backs him up on this, he twice said no before acceding on the third try. But to go back to your question, which wasn't about the search committee, it was this health, yeah.
Right.
So, you know, in addition to having this truly singular political career over 4 decades, and this man has exercised tremendous impact on the way we live our lives as Americans today, particularly after 9/11. There is also the fact that Dick Cheney is a singular creature in the annals of human medicine. Mm-hmm. Doctors can point to other people walking around planet Earth today who've had 5 heart attacks and a heart transplant. Doctors cannot point to anyone else walking around on planet Earth today besides Dick Cheney, who had his first cardiac event in the 1970s and is still around to tell you about it. And so every advance that's been made in cardiac medicine over the years, somehow, sort of in a kind of cardiac Forrest Gump way, Dick Cheney was there, needing that advance very badly and benefiting from it. Everything you can do to a heart patient, Dick Cheney's had done to him. He's truly a singular figure.
And speaking of the heart, and not the physical heart, one of the things that, as a press secretary, you're always frustrated with a political figure or a boss that is reluctant to talk about themselves is that I always knew that the Cheneys were very generous people, but they don't talk about it. One of the things I knew that they did was provide the heart defibrillators to all the places of worship in Washington, D.C. No one ever knew about it. And so I've always felt that he was a lot more generous than that anyone gives him credit for being.
You know, you mentioned his business career, and of course he was CEO, very well remunerated, at Halliburton. And that has given rise to just decades now of completely baseless speculation about the vice president having been a profiteer somehow off the decision to go to war. It's worth pointing out that the most prosecutorial book about Dick Cheney that exists is one called Angler that was published in, I think, 2009 by a respected Washington journalist named Barton Gellman. It's the kind of book that takes every sequence of events and draws the most kind of darkest conclusion about Cheney's role in each matter as it proceeds. It's a well-reported book, but it's very tendentious. And even Barton Gellman in Angler came to the conclusion after a vast review of the man's career and documents that there is no reason ever to think, there's no evidence to support the idea that Dick Cheney ever did anything in his political career to profit. And as a matter of fact, took a substantial loss to leave Halliburton and go back into government.
You talked to him, and maybe you could explain his decision that's been quite different from President George W. Bush in the post-presidency, to be vocal and to be a critic of the successor. Why does he do that?
I think he's a fighter by nature, Dick Cheney, but also he is in a setting where the man he served, who was at the top of the ticket and the top of the hierarchy in the White House, has followed his own father's admirable practice of abstaining from criticism of their successors in the Oval Office. So that leaves Dick Cheney to venture into the arena, time and again, to serve as the chief defender of the Bush-Cheney legacy.
Yeah.
It is not simply the case that Barack Obama has, in some cases, deviated sharply from the policies of the Bush-Cheney administration. He has continually asserted that the problems he faces as commander-in-chief are byproducts of Bush and Cheney's decisions. And so that calls out for a defense from someone in that administration. Cheney knows he carries unique gravitas. That was the word that was bandied about in 2000 when he was brought onto the ticket in the first place, gravitas. And so I think he feels comfortable in that role.
In talking with him, what do you think he wants his legacy to be, or does he not worry about it?
We got good insight into this just the other day. I had the privilege of attending the unveiling of Dick Cheney's official marble bust at the Capitol, a ceremony that was attended by Vice President Biden, former President George W. Bush, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, and others. And Cheney spoke last after the bust, which was a pretty good likeness, had been unveiled. Excuse me. And at the end of his remarks, Cheney said, if anyone walking through Statuary Hall and the Capitol grounds should ever pause to linger in front of this bust of me for more than 5 seconds, I would hope they would come away knowing at least this much, that here was a believer in the United States of America. And so that, I think, is our surest indication of how he wishes to be viewed in history.
But does he worry about his legacy?
No. I think one of the reasons why Dick Cheney has been so effective over the years is because he never had his index finger to the winds. He is never a politician who will change his views just because suddenly public opinion has shifted and it's politically convenient for him to do so.
Yeah. Loyalty was an important part of any administration, and of course in the Bush-Cheney White House it was prized. One thing I always think about politicians is if you see people who have worked for them for decades, you know that there's a strong amount of loyalty there and that loyalty goes both ways. Right. Did you talk to anybody outside of, that had worked for him over the years before you talked to him for this book? I just signed a whole bunch of books for someone who bought 32 of them. Very nice.
So that is a model for you all to follow. This is a former staffer of Cheney's. He is one of 4 people who are called the old staff, which is to say they worked for Dick Cheney in the House of Representatives, in the Department of Defense, and the Office of the Vice President. I think there's 4 of those people left today. And he does inspire great loyalty amongst his staff. But in terms of the relationship between him and George W. Bush, and you talk about how much loyalty is prized by the President of the United States, in Cheney one-on-one, Cheney tells me that, quote, and this is the word he used, central to his relationship with George W. Bush was the fact that Cheney had forsworn any attempt at running for the presidency himself, such that the President, when he received advice from Dick Cheney, always understood that it was being proffered without one eye cast on how it may or may not help Dick Cheney 4 years hence in the Iowa caucuses. And that was really important to George W. Bush.
So had Cheney seen that in previous administrations?
Oh, sure. He said that most of the reasons that people take the job of vice president is because they think it will give them a leg up on a nomination sometime down the road. And so he said it was central to his relationship with George W. Bush that Bush never had to worry about whether there was a political tinge to the advice that Dick Cheney was giving.
How much did Watergate affect his thinking?
More than he understood. And I think one of the aspects of our interview where he came away understanding himself a little better was how profoundly Watergate shaped his thinking and his future career. Dick Cheney made it his personal project when he was vice president to do everything he could to restore the powers of the presidency, of the executive, that he saw having been improperly eroded during Vietnam and Watergate. This took concrete forms such as the War Powers Act, the Budget and Impoundment Act, and various other encroachments by Congress onto the powers of the executive. And whether it was his legal posture in the fight over the notes from his Energy Committee, or war powers after 9/11, or other areas of policy, Dick Cheney always approached it from the point of view that the executive has to be strengthened, has to be restored for the kinds of crises and challenges that he and George W. Bush were facing.
What about the day of 9/11? I always am interested to hear all the different viewpoints of the people that were there. You know, living in New York, I meet a lot of people who were here that day. One of my friends owned a bar at the time and stayed open continuously for several days just to make sure that everybody had what they needed. But back at the White House, the President of the United States is traveling, and Cheney is there in the Situation Room. What did he tell you about that?
In Cheney one-on-one, he really narrates his day of 9/11 almost on a minute-by-minute basis with me, and it's really riveting. We have to understand that all of us as Americans shared in 9/11 in some way or other. My parents were bombed out of their apartment building here in Manhattan. We all felt a sense of grief, of shock, of anxiety. We felt terrified, right? But only one American that day had it thrust on his shoulders to run the federal government in these hours of crisis, while President Bush was sort of hopscotching about the country on Air Force One, looking for a secure place to land. And that was Dick Cheney. And he tells in the book how he's sitting in his office, Vice President of the United States, on a sunny Tuesday. His Secret Service agents bust into his office, lift him out of his chair by the seat of his pants, drag him out of his office, down to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the PEOC, which is this bunker below the White House. Cheney was stunned. He said the entire senior staff was stunned, and he used, Dana, a very interesting phrase in describing this to me. He said, we all felt a sense of shock and awe, which of course is a phrase ordinarily associated with the Iraq War. He's seen weapons get passed around. The communications facilities in that bunker, which were established in World War II, are not up to 21st century scratch. They've got a ton of things on their hands, like trying to ground all the flights in the air right now and just get their arms around this thing. And they're operating under terrible fog of war conditions, such that they're getting false reports about pipe bombs going off at the State Department, there being 6 planes and not 4 planes involved in the attack, and so on. For Cheney, what kicked in immediately and helped him assume that burden, and if you look at the photographs that were taken in the PEOC, in the bunker that day, there's important people there, like Condoleezza Rice, who was the National Security Advisor at the time, others, Karen Hughes, a senior advisor to the president. But the body language in the photographs is unmistakable, that the lead person in the room, the undisputed authority, is Dick Cheney. And what kicked in for him was classified training that he'd received as a congressman and a member of House GOP leadership back in the 80s, when it was contemplated that the United States might face something like an all-out nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. He took classified training sessions in something called continuity of government. The first precept of which, when you want to keep the continuity of the government, you want to keep the government operating in a crisis atmosphere like that, is to preserve the line of succession, from the president to the vice president to the Speaker of the House. So the very first piece of advice that Dick Cheney gives George W. Bush on 9/11, and he tells me in the book, the president didn't like it, resisted it, ultimately listened to Dick Cheney, was stay out of Washington. Don't come back here until we know what we're dealing with. And, we have
some people, when they hear that, they think it's because Dick Cheney wanted to assume the power of the day. And what you're explaining is that, no, he was wanting to make sure that we had a president to look to.
That's right. And he kept in close contact, as best as those sketchy communications facilities permitted, with the president at all points. One of the most sensitive things you can ask Dick Cheney about, and I went into some detail with him on this, is the shoot-down order from 9/11. This is something that Dick Cheney had, I don't think anybody had even asked him about since 9/11, with the exception of the commissioners on the 9/11 Commission. He conveyed an order to the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, in those early hours, instructing the military to shoot down the airliner that eventually crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, but which was thought to be heading for the White House or the Capitol. And there's a tape recording of that conversation, and a fairly stunned Don Rumsfeld can be heard saying, on whose authority, Dick? Because after all, the vice president does not stand in the military's chain of command. And he tells him, from the president. The President of the United States gave me that authority in an earlier phone call. The problem is that in the 8 sets of official logs that were kept of all the principals' discussions on that horrific day, none of them record in the appropriate timeline or point in the chronology any such conversation between George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. And in an interview with Evan Thomas in 2001, Cheney slightly shifted his story about all of that. So I was determined to ask him about it. And I said to him, sir, do you understand why even people who are supporters of yours, admirers of Dick Cheney, have a problem with this, because it places you in what is, for Dick Cheney, a very unusual position, which is asserting something for which there is no evidentiary record. He said, no. It was the one time where he really gave me the Cheney treatment. He said, look, there's been confusion. We've never been able to pin down all the calls and the exact times. But this was one of the reasons why, he said, the president and I were interviewed jointly by the 9/11 Commission, which was a unique arrangement.
Fast forward then to Iraq. And what does he say about the false accusation that he lied, or that he was complicit in a lie about WMD intelligence?
One of the harshest assessments of Dick Cheney's role in the run-up to the Iraq War and his relationship to the intelligence surrounding WMD came from Condoleezza Rice in her memoir. We had staggered our conversations these 3 days such that the last day would be reserved for 9/11, Iraq, and something I called Cheney Addresses His Critics in History. And wherein I just simply read to him some of the harshest things that had been written about him by journalists, intellectuals, historians, and even some of his former colleagues. And he disputed what Condoleezza Rice said about his handling of classified intelligence and WMD. But then went on to respond in kind and talk at some great length about an instance where he felt that Condoleezza Rice had mishandled classified intelligence, and it's all in the book. But he also wants people to be reminded of the work of the Silberman-Robb Commission, which was the blue ribbon panel that President Bush established, I think, in 2004, to investigate how the intelligence community had got it so wrong about WMD stockpiles in Iraq. And that report concluded that there was not a single instance where senior policymakers had pressured intelligence analysts in the run-up to the Iraq War to come up with the quote-unquote right conclusion on Iraq. That's a very important conclusion of this blue ribbon panel, bipartisan and respected. I think it's fair to contrast the conclusions of the Robb-Silberman panel with what we see going on today, where we have the Pentagon Inspector General actively investigating claims by up to 50 intelligence analysts that their intelligence reporting and analysis on ISIS and our effort against ISIS has been routinely sanitized on its way up the chain of command to the president. That is a far more serious and apparently systemic problem with the manipulation of intelligence for national security area than I think anything we saw in the Bush-Cheney era.
One of the things that both Bush and Cheney were determined not to do was to blame the intelligence community for anything, which I think was the right thing to do. But does he talk about how they decided to stand in front of that bus for them?
Well, he didn't put it in those terms, but...
well, he's not a press secretary.
Right. He's a Westerner. Although you are as well.
Yes.
One of the things I did with Cheney was on day 2, I was very determined that we should spend some time just talking about the intelligence community, the intelligence product, because not only is Dick Cheney famously associated with the intelligence failure surrounding Iraq and WMD as a senior policymaker, but he is probably one of the longest running consumers of American intelligence product ever. His first classified intelligence briefings began for him when he was Deputy Chief of Staff to Gerald Ford in the 1970s and continued for the next 35 years. And I asked him specifically, was there a point along the way where you could observe that intelligence product became politicized? We constantly hear about the politicization of intelligence. Was there an era or an episode where that came into being? And he talked about the evolution of the intelligence community and the product that he had the opportunity to review for so long. And so it changed when the world changed. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the intelligence community found it was very good at counting missile silos and that sort of thing, but not at tracking non-state actors using disposable cell phones. And so when we did talk also about the 8 months before the 9/11 attacks and the claims by Richard Clarke and others that key warnings were overlooked by Mr. Bush and Cheney, one of the things he said was there was no actionable intelligence that such an attack was going to occur. And he asked, you know, at the time, how was the intelligence community configured? Were they, how many people did they have on the problem of Al-Qaeda, for example, and so on? So we talked at great length about his consumption of intelligence product and the reverence in which he holds the men and women the patriots who work in that field.
And vice versa, I think. Switching gears. What do you think, or did he talk about, what brings Dick Cheney joy?
His grandchildren. There were times where we were in between tapings, and he would get an update from somebody, either his wife or one of his assistants, saying that the gift had been delivered to the granddaughter, and he would say, "Yeah, did she like it?" And he wanted to know. You know, I would say that he's very involved with his grandchildren.
I know that one of them is involved. One of the girls is involved in the local rodeo scene, and he is the driver.
Yeah, he has to hitch the horse, and in the sort of vehicle that carries the horse, trailer.
The trailer.
Yes, thank you. Did that come off as a touch New Yorkery?
a little Staten Island.
The vehicle that carries the horse.
That would be a trailer.
That's
the horse
trailer, Mr. Chairman. And he drives with that, you know, hitched up to his truck. And, you know, sometimes I think from Washington to Wyoming, I think he's done that drive. And I think, as we talked about earlier, he's a voracious reader. And you know, there's probably an aspect of Dick Cheney that still likes being in the arena from time to time.
Sure.
But I think he's made his peace with his legacy.
Were there some favorite behind-the-scenes personal stories that he told you that you liked?
Well, just things that happened in the course of the tapings that, you know, one of my chief aims in writing this book, Dana, was to rescue this man from caricature. The caricature of Darth Vader. Because he's too important for that. You know, here's a man who has had this profound impact on the way we live as Americans. And to caricature him is to do a disservice to everyone who needs to understand his influence and the way his mind works. There were several hours during the 10 hours we spent together where he had this gorgeous yellow lab named Nelson, who sat in on the floor, and on the recordings the animal's heavy panting can occasionally be heard. And at one point this menacing figure, this sinister Darth Vader character, rises from the chair in his study and announces to me that we have to pause the recordings because, quote, I got to get my dog off to doggy daycare.
I love that part, and I marked it because, did you edit any of that out? I mean, I thought that was hilarious, that he would take his dog to doggy daycare and nobody in America would believe it.
Well, and just use the term doggy daycare. Doggy alone. And you know, so here's a real flesh and blood person. Dick Cheney enjoys a good joke. Dick Cheney will have a drink with you. Dick Cheney's quite garrulous if you know how to get him talking. You know, and at the initial lunch where we sort of sketched this out, we were at a steakhouse in Northern Virginia, and mindful of his epic cardiac profile, when he sat down, I said, now let's be clear at the outset, Mr. Vice President, I'm going to be ordering a steak on this side of the table. It's going to be cooked in butter. It's going to be in a scene over here. And he said, eat what you want. And he had a salad with demure pieces of salmon on top of it.
Do you feel bad about that now?
I guess this is there's a confession of sorts occurring here. One stray mention by me of Gerald R. Ford launched him into like a 15-minute disquisition on the new class of Gerald R. Ford aircraft carriers and the new suspension systems they've got. And he delved into the technical mechanics of it, and I confess to being lost in them, but struck by how garrulous he was. And how engaging he can be, you know, and he does have a sense of humor, but again, it's this clipped, Western, laconic, dry wit, and sometimes his eyes will tell you as much as his mouth does.
I always felt like he was looking out for me, and I think people might not understand what I mean, and maybe it is a Western thing, but my grandfather, I didn't grow up knowing the Cheneys. They lived in Jackson. My family's from the other side of the state, in the Black Hills, nearer to the Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. But my grandfather, who was very important to me in my life, was a Republican county commissioner. Actually, and you know, growing up in Wyoming, like everybody's Republican for the most part. So when you leave, and for the first time, if you go east of the Mississippi, your eyes are awakened to a different line of thinking and thought. So when I get to the White House, and I'm Junior Birdman, you know, deputy press secretary, and fairly intimidated, but like trying to put a brave face on it, I'll never forget that Dick Cheney in a meeting turned to me and he said, I'd love to hear more about your ranch. It's in Weston County, right, in Newcastle, Wyoming. And what about the Highway 16, which is where you get a great burger in Wyoming? And from there, I just felt like I had a really good personal relationship with him, and I don't think that he knows that.
Well, we will circulate this.
Well, we'll let him know. But I think that there is a reverence for Dick Cheney in conservative circles that only maybe now is starting to surface, and people are being willing to even say this. Yes, I am a fan of Dick Cheney, and I'm not afraid to announce it.
And that is true also of the political classes. He is regularly doing fundraisers and headlining fundraisers for like the National Republican Campaign Committee and so on. And again, the frequency with which Barack Obama, sometimes unsolicited, invokes Dick Cheney. There was a time in June where the president went on The Daily Show as his sort of paying of respects to the outgoing host, Jon Stewart, and was trying to sell the Iran deal, the nuclear deal at the time. And he said, you know, I think folks have some idea that if only Dick Cheney had been sitting there, we would have got a better deal. That's crazy. Now, the next day, I was at the White House, right? And I asked Josh Earnest, the White House press secretary, I said, why did he bring up Dick Cheney unsolicited? Does he see himself as the anti-Dick Cheney? And of course, Josh demurred and said he doesn't think that that's how the president would characterize himself. But I do think that Obama sees himself as kind of delivered by Providence to the Oval Office to undo the work of Dick Cheney in large measure. And it has been Dick Cheney who has been his chief critic in the Obama era, there was the period in the very memorable occasion in May 2009 where the two men gave seemingly dueling speeches on national security subjects, and they're kind of carried live with a split-screen effect that served in a way that President Obama couldn't have been pleased by to assert a kind of parity between them.
I remember that very well. You gave an interview, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about it here, which is something I'm interested in, is why should millennials care about Dick Cheney and learning about him outside of the caricature?
Sure. We will assume that, and it may not be a safe assumption, that students, millennial students, are receiving a kind of fair and balanced portrait of people like George Bush and Dick Cheney, and not a caricature. But the simple answer, the broad answer is history always matters, right? You can't know where you're going unless you first know where you've been, and so that's one broad stroke. But specifically, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney have had it was such a consequential presidency. And the effects of it are still being felt, perhaps not as profoundly as the two men would like. They feel that Barack Obama has determinedly undone a lot of good work that they did, and they think that the current state of Syria and Iraq is attributable not to the original invasion of Iraq in 2003, but to the failure of the current president to hold the line on some of the policies, such as the surge, the withdrawal of American troops, and so on. And so, if you care about the Middle East as it exists today, and how the threats from the Middle East are seeping into our country, as the residents of San Bernardino know so well, then you will want to read Cheney one-on-one and learn how the mind of this very influential man really works.
What about his reputation overseas, especially with world leaders overseas?
Dick Cheney is still in contact with a lot of world leaders overseas. He still travels to the Middle East from time to time. I think especially in the Middle East, amongst our Arab Gulf allies like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, UAE, Egypt, Qatar, Dick Cheney is still very well regarded and seen as the kind of leader that those allies wish were still in power.
This interview originally ran in Playboy magazine, which I know most people pick up for the articles, of course. It packed a big punch. Were you surprised at the reaction?
A bit, and very pleased by it. When I left his house for the last of the 3 days, he gave me very high praise. I said to him, "I hope you enjoyed this." He said, "It was time well spent," which in Cheney speak is effusive praise. And at that moment, I had on my hands 80,000 words of transcript, which is what this book is. It is the transcripts of our 10 hours of oral histories covering his entire life, with an overview by me. I took a small fraction, about 7,000 to 8,000 words, culled from different parts of the interview, and published it as the Playboy interview with Dick Cheney. Now, the Playboy interview is one of the most venerated journalistic formats of the last 60 years. Yeah, I mean, you've had Jimmy Carter, Fidel Castro, Martin Luther King, the Beatles, the founders of Google. We can go on. And we're not even talking about the starlets and the comedians. And Playboy was very pleased to have this. They even created a special leather-bound edition of just that month's issue, which was completely just brown with gold embossed lettering that said Dick Cheney. It's very rare that Heft does that. Playboy has a department that tabulates how frequently its content is being picked up in other media. They tabulated that the Playboy interview with Dick Cheney, conducted by James Rosen, had picked up 650 million hits around the world. And I was in the audience at the Washington Hilton in April of 2015 when President Obama himself commented on it. And he made the wisecrack we talked about earlier, which was, I see where Dick Cheney says that I'm the worst president of his lifetime, which is interesting, because I see Dick Cheney as the worst president of my lifetime.
What an insult to George Bush.
Well, probably...
point of personal privilege as a
former press
secretary,
intended,
right, intended to hurt President Bush.
In some respects. But it plays into a liberal shibboleth, which is that Dick Cheney was the malevolent power behind the throne and pulling the strings and so forth.
Bush's brain.
And nobody knows the falsity of that with greater, more painful firsthand experience than Dick Cheney, with the possible exception of Scooter Libby. I'm
going to ask you to wrap up with something that that Dick Cheney had not talked about before, really, at any length in public, and that was his faith and religion. If you could tell us about that.
Well, the one subject that Dick Cheney told me in advance he doesn't like to pursue in any depth with interviewers was religion. And yet, even there, we covered this subject in greater depth than he has anywhere else. And he talked to me about his Sunday school experiences in a Methodist church in Casper, Wyoming, where he grew up, his denominational migrations over the years, and his innermost beliefs about his faith. And to sit in Dick Cheney's study, surrounded by all those books, and as the man was soon to turn 74, having survived 5 heart attacks and a heart transplant, to hear him say to me, "I'm a Christian. I believe in a life hereafter," was very powerful. So if you love Dick Cheney, or you hate Dick Cheney, or you're a millennial and you're just starting to learn about George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and 9/11 in Iraq, if you read Cheney one-on-one, you will learn how this man's mind and his heart really work.
Oh, I love the book, and congratulations on the great interview and then being able to put it together. It's a really important piece of history, and I'm glad that you had a chance to do it.
I'm glad to spend this time with you. Thank you.
Thank you.